Hi, everyone. Welcome to Narkis Bible Study on February, should be the 12th, the Shabbat of the 12th. And we are looking at Luke 18, 1 through 8, the parable of the persistent widow. I'll just share my screen here. So I've put together this PowerPoint and I hope it's organized enough. But let's start. It's not too long of a little parable. And if I remember right, the last Bible study I led was on the unjust steward. So I have a very similar parable here tonight. So then Jesus told them a parable to show them they should always pray and not lose heart. He said, in a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. Instead of reading through the whole parable, I want to make some comments on these first two verses, actually a lot of comments, let's say, because this is really what's at the heart of the matter. It's actually strange that the meaning of the parable is preempted. It's put right up there before you even read the parable. And so I asked myself, why? And maybe there are two reasons. Maybe because of the shock of the comparison with God and an unjust judge that's going to come up, just to kind of give you the big picture of what the parable means before you get to it, lest you be outraged. But also it states the goal of this, that there's a need, that we realize there's a need to always pray and not despair. So, and we'll talk about that word in some other context as well. So to me, that says we're being told that there's a need to always pray, not despair, because there is a chance, there's a very real chance that we would despair in prayer. We would give up praying. And we have to be reminded that we need to pray and not despair over things or not give up. So just took this little word. It doesn't come that much in the New Testament, actually. What I've translated in our context as to despair, or what was it before? It said, they should not lose heart. Not lose heart. There you go. That's the Net Bible translation. So we only have it about 6 times in our New Testament, and it seems to be more of a New Testament word than in the Old Testament. There's plenty of places that could have translated, but it doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint. So here's our verses in the New Testament. We have 2 Corinthians 4, verse 1 and 16. Therefore, since we have this ministry, just as God has shown us mercy, we do not become discouraged. Therefore, we do not despair. That's in verse 16. So this is the same word in Greek, enkakin, to be bad. I mean, to feel bad, basically. But even if our physical body is wearing out, our inner person is being renewed day by day. Another context in Galatians 6:9. So we must not grow weary in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not give up. Ephesians 3:13. For this reason, I ask you not to lose heart because of what I am suffering for you, which is your glory. And there the question is whether not losing heart is their glory or what he's suffering for them is their glory. You could take it either way. And then 2 Thessalonians 3:13, but you, brothers and sisters, do not grow weary in doing what is right. So this losing heart is in context of growing weary or something continual that wears you down, that makes you discouraged over time, or makes you despair, or makes you lose heart. These are all, I've highlighted them all. They're all different translations of the same word in Greek. So this is what we are trying to avoid this becoming discouraged or despairing that anything could change, growing weary, losing heart. And I guess the word discouraged really comes from losing heart, right? Core. Haven't researched that, but it seems to me. So we have this goal that we should remember the need. It doesn't have that in the translation, but it says the need for praying and not to lose heart. And then he starts a parable. In a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. So I just want to talk about those two characteristics. They're quite central to this parable. So first of all, the fear of God. It comes in the Bible a lot as either the phrase fear of God or as God-fearers, Yireh Elohim in Hebrew. Fovumenos ton theon is the words in our parable, which may or may not be similar to how the Hebrews translated in Septuagint. This is a key phrase and concept in the Abraham stories, which I happen to be teaching right now. So I was immediately pulled there. I've been teaching with my new cohort of translators and consultants in training, the Abraham stories. And I'm trying to teach biblical Hebrew, but using the Abraham stories as our greater context. And so the first occurrence of the fear of God is in the Abraham stories. And we have in the Abraham stories, you have 3 stories that are she's my sister story. 2 refer to Abraham, 1 to Isaac. It's in Genesis 12, 20, and 26. And we could do a whole Bible study on just those stories. And I'm very tempted to, but I can't tonight. But if you've read those stories recently, you have to read them in triplicate. You have to read all 3 together because each story reveals a little bit more. The first story is very laconic. It barely gives you the raw details, and you're left with all kinds of open questions. And the second story fills it in a bit more. And then the third story with Rebecca is the best case scenario out of those 3. Anyway, we get in chapter 20, Abraham, the Philistine or the Philistine country king calls Abraham in and says, why did you lie to us that she's your sister? And his response is, because I thought, I'm trying to move your pictures up here. Because I thought, surely no one fears God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. So I put in parentheses, presumably this is the same reason in Genesis 12, but there Pharaoh doesn't give Abraham a chance to talk. He says, what in the world have you done? Get out of here. So this time the king actually questions him and he gets a response. So what's been motivating Abraham this whole time is he's convinced there's no fear of the Lord in this place or fear of God. And so we have to think about what does it mean to fear God? Can there be the fear of God in a place where people don't actually know the Lord? What does that phrase mean? But later on, I just want to jump, since we're already in Abraham, in Genesis 22:12, where it's the binding of Isaac. At the climax of the story, where the angel stops Abraham from killing his son, he says, do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. And it uses this form, Yireh Elohim, you're a God-fearer, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. I like the Net Bible's note there, what it means to be a God-fearer in that context. They put obedience that grows from faith. So the reason Abraham didn't withhold his son from God is that he had a habit of believing and a habit of obeying God, because he knew God was ultimately in control. So I kind of like that idea because it's a habitual thing. And actually that ties very well into Genesis 15, verse 6, which I did not bring in my PowerPoint, but please go look it up. The verse that says, and he believed, God takes him outside, he shows him the stars and says, this will be your descendants. And it says, and he believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The Hebrew there specifically uses a form that is not a one-time event. It says vehe'emin, which would be equivalent to saying, and he was believing, or he used to believe. And of course, in that story, it is a one-time event that he was taken outside at that particular occasion, and he chose to believe on that particular occasion. But the way the author tells us that is to include all the previous, he used to believe. And so this occasion too, he believed. Or even in this occasion, you could say he believed. And so there's this persistence of faith. And ironically, even though it comes in the other half of the parable in a different way, that's also a focus in this parable. And I think that's kind of why I'm going into it a bit. But fear the Lord. Of course, in the context of Israel and God, if you think in Exodus 20, verse 20, we have the law being given at Sinai. And Moses says to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, so that you do not sin. So here, fearing God leads someone not to sin. That's the end result of fearing God. And then this is nicely paralleled back in our Abraham story. That same second story where Abraham comes to the king in Gerar, and the king has called him and said, why didn't you tell me she was your sister? And the reason he knows to call Abraham in is because God appeared to him in a dream. And this is what God told him in the dream. Yes, I know that you have done this with a clear conscience. Like, yes, I know you didn't think she was a wife. That is why I've kept you from sinning against me, and why I did not allow you to touch her. So ironically, in this verse, you have Abram thinking no one fears God, when this is exactly the fear of God, where God knows his good conscience of this king. And so he preserved him from sinning against him. And that ties with the same goal in Exodus 20:20, that so that you won't sin against God. Okay. Also in Exodus 18:21, when, if you remember, after the battle with Amalek, where they've just asked, is God really with us? Amalek attacks, and then, Moses raises his hands. They win. When he lowers, they lose. And at the end, they win, they build an altar. And then right after that, Jethro comes to visit Moses, and Moses is overwhelmed. And so Jethro gives him advice on choosing leaders and to basically delegate. And so how are you going to choose leaders? And this is the verse in Exodus 18:21. But you choose from the people capable men, that's Anshe Hail, God-fearing men, men of truth, those who hate bribes, or you could say hate ill-gotten gain, and put them over the people as rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. So one of the characteristics that's so important for these leaders, whether they be small rank leaders or high rank leaders, is that they are God-fearing. And if you use the context as a way of describing what that is, you will see you have to love the truth and you have to hate bribery. So it has to do with being fair. In 2 Samuel 23:3, we also have a parallel. The one who rules fairly among men, the one who rules in the fear of God. So a repetition of the same kind of line can can equate the two together. And so basically ruling fairly among men is having fear of God. So when you act fairly, you're fearing the Lord. And then again, in a context of governors in Nehemiah 5:15, but the former governors who preceded me had burdened the people and had taken food and wine from them, in addition to 40 shekels of silver. Their associates were also domineering over the people, but I did not behave in this way due to my fear of God. So you have that contrast there of how Nehemiah was acting, or in contrast to other governors. And all the different ways that people can be abused and extorted, basically, here mostly financially. So really, if you look at context in the Bible, God-fearing is most relevant for positions of power, because that's where power can be easily abused. And basically, who's going to keep a leader in check? Who's going to keep a king in check, or a judge, or any of these positions? God is. And it's this divine accountability ultimately that leads to morality, because someone realizes, okay, I might be able to hide from everyone else, but God still sees. Like, no one else can touch me. I'm at the top of the ladder, but God's above me. And so it's remembering that keeps them moral, keeps them from sinning, and keeps them not just sinning in general, but keeps them from abusing people under them. So this judge we have in the parable has no fear of God. So there is nothing, he has no divine accountability. There's no reason for him to be moral here. So we can assume he's the kind of person who all these other verses we're talking about negatively, who would take a bribe, who would ignore justice, who would not be fair, that person's going to pay me off, or it might be my friend, or I don't know what. So that's the kind of character we are dealing with, even though he is a judge and he has that position of authority, you could say. In addition to his complete lack of morality or complete lack of fear of God, he doesn't even have a respect of men. And this isn't an idiom in the Bible per se, but it's basic to most cultures. You care about your reputation. If you're part of a society, you want to be stay looking good, especially if you happen to be from a honor shame culture, which this part of the world historically is. So maybe if you had no respect for God, or you didn't believe he was there watching, there's no divine accountability, maybe your want for social respect would somehow motivate you to still do the right thing. You want to save face, you want to appear to be good in front of other people. But in this case, he's got neither. So it's a negative. So I put in my colloquial idiom, the judge just doesn't give a rip at all. So we have a worst case scenario here. This is a bad deal. And now we move on in the parable. There was also a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, "Give me justice against my adversary." For a while he refused, but later on he said to himself, "Though I neither fear God nor have regard for people, yet because this widow keeps on bothering me, I will give her justice, or in the end she will wear me out by her unending pleas." Okay, so here we have a widow entering the scene, and she's really a symbol of disenfranchised, or someone who lacks all power in society. We have not only in the Bible, but also like Hammurabi's code, several laws in the ancient Near East. They consider the sign of a good king someone who would care for widows and orphans, because to maintain order in society that would like protect the most disenfranchised would be an important thing. Then you can then you can claim that your society or culture has something to it. And sure enough, in our law, in our Torah, in Exodus 22:22, we have the verse, you must not afflict any widow or orphan. Le'anot, there is the word to abuse, afflict. It's the same thing the Egyptians did to the Israelites. And they're commanded not to do that to a widow or orphan. Deuteronomy 10:18 is talking about God, and I want to read this a little bit more in 2 slides away. But one of God's characteristics is that he justly treats the orphan and widow, and he loves resident foreigners, giving them food and clothing. And again in Deuteronomy 24:17, you must not pervert justice due a resident foreigner or an orphan, or take a widow's garment as security for a loan. So here you have a threefold description of potentially disenfranchised in the society, a resident foreigner. He doesn't have any say. He's not a citizen. And I can vouch for that. When you're not a citizen, you don't have as much power. Almost in every issue you might have, you have less power than a citizen. So you're naturally vulnerable. And then an orphan who's vulnerable without a head of household looking out for them. And then a widow. And so in all three of these categories, you're not supposed to pervert justice or turn away, a just ruling. In Isaiah 123, Isaiah has some pretty hard words for the people, both in verse 17, I think, and also in this verse. And he's describing the people as in sharp contrast to what they should be ideally. Your officials are rebels. They associate with thieves. All of them love bribery and look for payoffs. They do not take up the cause of the orphan or defend the rights of the widow. And so defending the rights, this is a legal thing. And this is something that, as I said, the leaders are supposed to do. They're supposed to legally make sure that the most vulnerable in society are going to be looked after and people won't abuse them because they're weak and they can be abused. And I'll just point out, there's so many passages. Obviously, we're not going to read them all here tonight, but it makes an impact on you. But look at this one in Deuteronomy 16:14. This is where you're supposed to go up to the temple or the place the Lord will choose to put his name. You are to rejoice in your festival. You, your son, your daughter, your male and female slaves, the Levites, the resident foreigners, the orphans, and the widows who are in your villages. Notice this list is from top to bottom. The Levites didn't have land, and so they were also vulnerable because they relied on other people giving their food for a tithe, or they're not going to eat. And so if other people aren't going to be obedient, they're going to starve. So they're in a vulnerable spot. And then, of course, the foreign residents or resident foreigners, and then the orphans. And look who's at the bottom of the pile. It's the widows. So it's not a coincidence here that we have a widow going to this unjust judge. As I said before, like the unjust judge is the negative, like the worst of the worst. And now we have a widow. So we could see her as the weakest of the weakest. She is the epitome of vulnerable and has no power. So this situation should strike you as basically the worst possible scenario you could have. A bad character judge with power and no accountability, and a widow with nothing and no power whatsoever. Obviously, the assumption is that a widow would be poor because she's left without means of livelihood and no one to defend her. So it really looks like a hopeless case, actually. And that's interesting in the context of prayer, or it interests me in the context of prayer. And the Lord said, listen to what the unrighteous judge says. So this is the first time this judge is called unrighteous. And that's what reminded me of the other parable in chapter 16, because the steward there who was crafty was called the steward of unrighteousness. And I think in that context, it was more worldly, unrighteous in the sense that dealing with normal money issues that aren't like spiritual things. Where here, I think he really is unrighteous because he has no fear of the Lord and he doesn't care about anybody else. He's pretty much just selfish. So listen to what the unrighteous judge says. Won't God give justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long to help them? So this is the kind of the shock contrast Jesus is making between God and this judge. And that's why I said at the beginning, it helps to know where he's going with the parable if you're going to make such a shocking contrast. Who would dare compare God to an unjust judge? But he's obviously making a point. And we have a rabbinic principle of interpretation, and I know there are Latin names for this as well, but in Hebrew it's kal v'chomer, light and heavy. And if something is true in a light case, how much more in a heavier case? So if it's true, if something's true in the case of this hopelessly bad judge, how much more would it be true with the complete opposite? And this parable really takes the kal and the homer to extremes. They are opposite ends of the spectrum. And let's just remind ourselves again, I'm going to read again that verse we read in Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 20 about what God's character is. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who is unbiased and takes no bribe, who justly treats the orphan and widow, and who loves resident foreigners, giving them food and clothing. So you must love the resident foreigner because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Revere the Lord your God. There's that fear of the Lord. It says, fear the Lord your God, serve him, be loyal to him, and take oaths only in his name. So here you have kind of like the exact opposite picture of this judge of unrighteousness. And on the very points where the judge is bad, God is actually good. It's his business card. It's his calling card that he defends orphans and widows. And he helps the people who are disenfranchised in society. That's who he is. That is his nature. And he helps out the foreigner and all those people who are weak in terms of world's ranking of people. And then there's that parallel to fearing him, because fearing him is remembering who he is and acting accordingly. So if you know that's his character, you can trust him basically with everything. Now, so back to this crazy contrast. If a dishonest judge would still yield to the persistence and prayer of a widow, how much more would the upright God and Father of all answer prayer, and presumably persistent prayer? So it kind of takes this completely impossible situation and flips it, like, how could anything not be possible? Because we have a completely different character of a God than the one in this parable. And if it could happen even in that parable, it could happen for us and in every situation. I tell you, he will give them justice speedily. So here we have that contrast between the judge, who for a while wasn't inclined to do anything about her case. So this case kept going on and on. She kept coming back, and he kept ignoring her until he finally decided it's just easier for him to give her what she's asking than to have to listen to her all the time. And so that's being contrasted with God, who would quickly answer. And what's he answering? Do I have it here? I didn't point that out, but the implication when it says his chosen ones who cry out to him night and day, to be crying out is usually the context of being oppressed or persecuted. And so maybe that also might influence how we understand this parable. It's not just like every prayer of, oh God, I want a red bicycle, so speedily give it to me. It's more like when we are in the position of having nothing, like that widow, maybe we're being abused in some way, we're being denied vital sustenance, or I don't know, maybe we're being persecuted for our faith or something, that God will give us justice. But then the parable ends with this kind of summation. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And that's kind of there. I mean, there's a whole debate. You can read Fitzmyer on his commentary to Luke. And there's a whole debate whether the last few verses are part of the original parable or not. I'm inclined to think that they are, but this verse seems to kind of tie back into the previous section about the Son of Man coming, and a little bit more future oriented. And here, the question then is, will he find faith on earth? And I would just like to shift our attention to that saying. The first thing is, it's reminiscent of Luke 7:9. Not even in Israel have I found such faith as this, about the crumbs under the table. I should have brought that verse for you. Maybe we can look at it afterwards. But that is also a context of what we would call here in Israel chutzpah, where you are daring to ask out of either just blatant desperation or just a hope, a prayer that you're so desperate for it, you just ask anyway. And also the aspect of persistence. I mean, the things that connect these two passages are this kind of daring, this widow who has no power, and yet she dares to just keep coming back and asking anyway. It's somehow related to persistence in my mind. And then the whole concept of faith. As you saw, if you were looking in the Greek, this last verse, will he find faith? Pistis is your normal word for faith. And in Hebrew, we say emunah. But as I like to say, Jesus and his disciples are thinking first and foremost in Hebrew, and later everything is recorded in Greek. And Hebrew, emunah, faith, it's faith, and it's also faithfulness. And really, there is no distinction in the word. It's the same word. And how you choose to translate actually depends how you understand the context. In the battle with the Amalekites, it says Moses' hands were faith. And in the Greek, it actually says pistis there. But contextually, it means his hands were physically steady. They were persistent. They could hold up. Most contexts where it talks about God's faith, it translates faithfulness. But then oftentimes when it talks about people's faith, it will alternate between faith and faithfulness. And so it leads me to do a lot of pondering on that. A lot of faith is faithfulness. What is faith? It's being faithful. And sometimes I think we have, especially in the context of prayer, maybe we have this idea that we need to muster up faith. Basically we treat it as if it's a feeling. Like we need to get in the zone. And if I just do this, that is faith, that is it. But actually, I think this widow here, her faithfulness is that she just keeps coming back and asking. She doesn't stop. It doesn't say, she might have been completely distraught. She might have been depressed. She might have been completely disillusioned with life. None of those feelings mattered. What mattered was that she just kept coming back and asking and asking and asking. And so that's what I think this statement, will I find, or will the Son of Man find faith on the earth? I think it's this idea of, will people faithfully be asking? Are you still just coming back to God, asking consistently and faithfully? And even in the cases that don't seem to you resolvable, you could say naturally, like this widow and the unjust judge. And so that takes us back to the very first sentence of Jesus telling us this parable to remind us of our need to pray. We need to pray. And then as we hear the parable, and with this last phrase, we see that we need to pray faithfully all the time. All the time, I think, with the context of coming back and coming back and coming back, not necessarily one big continual prayer, although that wouldn't be bad, but occasionally you might have to eat or talk to other people too. But to just keep coming back and being persistent. So I will end my talk there, and you can chew on that and we can open it up for some discussion.